Kia ora koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai. I'm Paul Clark from the University of Auckland and Director of the North Asia Cape Centre of Asia Pacific Excellence. The three Capes have joined together, Latin America Cape, North Asia, and Southeast Asia, to help support this important gathering. And welcome to you all here in person in Auckland, and to the 90 people joining us on Zoom. This is a very good turnout. The event is sponsored by the Japan-New Zealand Business Council, the Latin America-New Zealand Business Council, the British-New Zealand Business Association, and the ASEAN-New Zealand Business Council. The turnout today, online and here in person, is an indication, I think, of a recognition that trade is so important to a medium-sized country at the bottom of the earth, like us. But trade is more than just goods and services passing between countries. Trade also helps embed a country like New Zealand in a whole series and layers of networks and relationships that are as important movement of goods and services. By being embedded in connections around the world through trade, we gain so much more than simply the revenue from goods and services. I'll now hand over to my co-host, Justine Arrell from Fonterra, Trade Strategy Manager at Fonterra, who will introduce our main speaker and the rest of the fine panel that we have assembled for this occasion. So again, welcome online and in person. Thank you all for being here. I'm sure we will learn a great deal. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Paul Clark. I am not Justine. Thank you very much for your warm introduction. We really appreciate all Capes sponsoring this event. Fantastic turnout. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome. My name is Juliana Silveira and I am the CEO of the Latin America New Zealand Business Council. It's been my pleasure collaborating with Liz Bell from ASEAN Council, with Phil Wood from the British Association, and Sarah McLaughlin from the Japanese Council, in delivering this, to bring you this event, making CPTPP work for Aotearoa New Zealand business. A very warm welcome from all of us. Just before we introduce Justine and we kick things off, if you are not a member of any of the councils here today, today's your lucky day. We are all here and available to talk to you. And guess what? If you are already a member of one of the councils, congratulations, you're doing really well. And but there is no rule that says that you can't be a member of more than one council. So please make sure that you come and talk to us. We'll be here after the event and very keen to learn more about your businesses and opportunities for exports. It's my privilege to introduce you to our moderator, Justine Arrell. Justine is the General Manager of Trade Strategy at Fonterra. She's responsible for driving Fonterra's engagement and advocacy on strategic global trade issues, including trade and sustainability. A former New Zealand diplomat, Justine held a range of trade and environment policy roles in the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade prior to joining Fonterra. Most recently, this included a posting to Washington, D.C., where she was responsible for advocacy in relation to a range of bilateral and multilateral trade and environment issues. Justine has also previously served in the New Zealand High Commission in London and as an advisor to the Minister of Trade and Climate Change issues. Justine, thank you very much for taking over this role. Over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Juliana and Paul, for the kind introduction. And to the Latin American New Zealand Council, the British New Zealand Business Council, the Japan New Zealand Business Council, and the ASEAN New Zealand Business Council, as well as the Centres for Asia Pacific Excellence. Thank you all very much for your support in bringing us this event today. We're very privileged to have a great lineup of expert speakers for you to hear from today, and I will introduce those to you shortly. But before I do that, I did just want to make a few introductory comments regarding the topic of discussion today, which is making the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or the CPTPP, and making that work for Aotearoa New Zealand businesses. As many of you will know, the CPTPP is a trade agreement originally between 11 economies in the Asia Pacific region, including New Zealand, Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Malaysia, Japan, Mexico, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. The original agreement, signed back in 2018, opened new markets for New Zealand exporters that at that time accounted for around 13% of global GDP and a combined population of more than 500 million people. For New Zealand goods exporters, the agreement reduces tariffs and non-tariff barriers. For services exporters, CPTPP provides greater openness and certainty over the conditions under which New Zealand businesses can provide services to overseas clients across a range of sectors. The agreement also contains provisions to promote sustainable economic development with commitments to safeguard high labour and environmental standards across the region. The agreement is what is referred to in trade terms as an open plurilateral, which means that additional economies that can meet the high standards of the agreement can seek to join. The UK was the first cab off the rank, and there is a long line of economies who have also expressed an interest in joining. The agreement is intended to remain dynamic, with CPTPP economies committed to ensuring that the rules and disciplines in the agreement keep pace with the changing global landscape and ensure that CPTPP remains at the forefront of global trading arrangements. The parties agreed to carry out a review of the agreement within 3 years of the agreement entering into force and at least 5 years, every 5 years thereafter. The first of these review processes is currently underway, and New Zealand exporters have had the opportunity to provide input and feedback. And this provides a richness of material for our discussion today. Without further ado, it is therefore my pleasure to introduce our keynote addressee and the expert lineup of business panelists that we have the privilege of hearing from this afternoon. First up, to provide the keynote address, a man who probably needs no introduction to an audience such as this, we have Vangelis Vitalis, the Deputy Secretary, Trade and Economic at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Vangelis has played a leadership role in almost every one of New Zealand's recent FTAs as Chief Negotiator in New Zealand's agreements with the EU, ASEAN, Malaysia, and the CPTPP. He was New Zealand's APEC senior official during New Zealand's host year in 2021 and chaired the senior officials process that supports the CPTPP ministerial meetings during New Zealand's chair year in 2023, which oversaw the accession of the UK to the agreement. Prior to taking up his role in Wellington in 2017, Vangelis was New Zealand's permanent representative to the WTO in Geneva and ambassador to the European Union and NATO in Brussels. Welcome, Vangelis.
Thank you, Justine, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and thank you particularly to the Chambers of Commerce that have brought this together today. Look, I'm going to speak in sort of essentially 4 elements. The first is I'm going to sketch very briefly the context, because it is an audience that knows that the golden weather is truly over, and I'm not going to labour that point, but I want to make a couple of points about how challenging this environment now is becoming. And then I want to turn to some of the choices we have and how crucial and central, in fact, CPTPP is to the way in which we need to think about managing some of that geopolitical risk out there. Then I'll make some concluding observations, but I want to leave you with 3 thoughts about CPTPP. First of all, it clearly is of enormous commercial benefit to us. Country that depends on 1 in 4 jobs, depending on exports, incomes, employment, CPTPP does deliver genuine commercial benefits. So there is a clear commercial and economic reason why we're doing this, but that's not the only reason. The second is CPTPP, and I've got a lovely graph to show you, gives us strategic trade depth. It helps us manage some of the risk, and it's an important part of our diversification strategy. And the third reason why CPTPP is so critical to our future is that this agreement puts us at the heart of future rulemaking within not just the region, but genuinely because this is a global agreement, as the UK's accession has demonstrated. So those are the 3 elements that I hope you have in your head as we go through this discussion: the commercial, the strategic, and then, of course, being at the heart of the rulemaking process. So let me just say a few words about the international context. The first is to say, yes, the golden weather is over, but let me add to that, the jungle is definitely growing back. And the geopolitics is certainly bearing down on us. It is not just the case that it's the US and China. We are increasingly the collateral damage in that. And by we, I mean CPTPP members, I mean individually, and I do mean the small and medium-sized states. So New Zealand knows what that is like, because steel and aluminium tariffs imposed by the Trump administration and continued by the Biden administration continue to be applied against us. Australia knows it because of the actions that China took against Australian wine exporters, Australian coal exporters, and Australian barley exporters. So we do know that when the great powers decide to step outside the rules, we run the risk of having material damage to our interests as a consequence. The third element I want to observe, which is an obvious point to make, is the impact that the wars in the Middle East and, of course, in Ukraine are continuing to have on trade and trade flows. So quite apart from the moral and human catastrophe underway there is a serious challenge there for us, both in terms of prices increasing, but also because of the additional time it is now taking to get inputs into the New Zealand economy that drive our exports, but also for our exports to certain parts of the globe are taking between 2 and 6 weeks longer than they would normally. And then, of course, my last contextual observation is elections. We've had a series of major elections this year: Indonesian presidency, we've had the Indian election, that massive exercise underway there, which is now concluded, of course. And of course, we've had the European parliamentary elections, which then triggered a French national election, and we'll see what those results look like. We've got the UK election as well, and I do think that has going to have implications for UK trade policy as well. Not my thing to comment on, and I know there are other colleagues here from the High Commission, better placed than me to speak about that, but again, consequential elections. And then, of course, there's the November election, which I know everyone here will be following, as we certainly are, very closely indeed, because that will have consequences no matter who wins, and there will be things that we will need to be thinking about there. So that then brings me to this challenging environment that we're in. We essentially have 3 choices. The first choice is to persuade the great powers to step back into the rules-based trading system, to make the point to them that the economics is madness of what they're doing, to think of the brilliant data point that they can't have understood or must have missed. I've been in this role 8 years, and I'm afraid that the brilliant arguments aren't working anymore. So my very reluctant conclusion is that is not an option anymore that we should pursue. Certainly, we need to make the point to the big powers that this rules-based trading system fundamentally matters to us as a small state. But I think we need to start thinking about some other ways of mitigating risk rather than waiting for the great powers to come to their senses. So the second option, of course, is to say, well, it's a realist world. This is the way it is. And we just need to, in the inimitable New Zealand expression, suck it up. And indeed, 2,500 years ago, of course, the great Thucydides, the great Greek historian, reminds us that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So maybe that's what we need to do. We're weak, we must suffer what we must, and the strong, the Chinas, the US, the EU, the Indias, they do what they can. I don't think that's an option for us. So I'm in favor of the third option. The third option is all about our agency. So as a small state, we do have agency here. We need to remember too, we're not alone. The overwhelming bulk of members of the World Trade Organization are, of course, small and medium-sized states. They too, like us, care about this rules-based trading system. What can we do together with them? How do we work better and more effectively with them? How can we be proactive, not provocative? How do we create the space around us to avoid the kinds of situations where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must? And that now does bring me to how critical CPTPP is for this strategy. So Justine outlined for you some of the core elements at a sort of a strategic level of the importance of CPTPP, and I don't want to run through those again, but suffice to say, 4 new trade agreements, essentially, 2 of them with G7 economies at the time, so Canada and Japan, G20 economy Mexico, new free trade agreement with them as a consequence of CPTPP, and then, of course, Peru was added to that. And then we had the G7 member from across the Atlantic, across the seas, from the United Kingdom added into it as well. You heard about the more than 500 million consumers, how critical that market is. But I want to also make the point that we sometimes forget, and I'd like to see if I can get my next slide up. Thank you very much. China is a critical partner of ours, a critical trading partner. It is a major global economy, huge demand, and a very important trading partner, as you can see here. We have a free trade agreement with China and with Hong Kong. So we have some rules, and an international treaty with them, and that's where 23% of our exports go to. What we often forget, however, is that we have another trade agreement with CPTPP where actually we send 27% of our exports. And now with the United Kingdom as a member, we get up to 30% of our exports. And then you can see what we're trying to do, which is develop that strategic trade depth for us to manage and diversify our risk, your risk as business, to think of these additional opportunities, because then you've got the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, then you've got the recently entered into force agreement with the European Union, and you can see all of those additional elements that are designed to create those opportunities for New Zealand businesses. And essentially we have at present about 70% of our trade, just over 70% of our trade covered by these international treaties, which, by the way, are enforceable, as Canada has now discovered to its cost in the case that we have taken against them through on dairy tariff rate quotas. Bit of unfinished business there with the Canadians, but nevertheless, that is part of what being a member of an international treaty means. So you can see what we're trying to do. You can see how important CPTPP is to us there, in addition to the various tariff, services, government procurement benefits, and the investment facilitation measures that are in the agreement that I hope we're going to talk about as part of the panel shortly. I want to also point out too that in the digital space, important, groundbreaking new rules that were established, now somewhat out of date, but at the time, groundbreaking in the sense that as a New Zealand business, you did not anymore have to store your data in Vietnam or in Malaysia or in any other CPTPP partner. The data localization commitments meant that you could store your data where you chose, and the other CPTPP partner could not make contingent on your access to the fact that you'd have to store your data there as well. So some very important ways to reduce your transaction costs and to reduce some of the red tape that businesses face, even in the digital space. Let me talk briefly about the next steps with CPTPP. So CPTPP is now somewhat out of date. We pride ourselves on this being a gold standard agreement, and we need to keep it as a gold standard. So one of our key priorities last year, when we were chairing CPTPP and hosting the ministers here, was to give it that energy and momentum. So there was an agreement for terms of reference for a review, and that is now well underway thanks to Canada's able chairing this year. So we have an active review. Each of the chapters is being worked through, and we have been seeking business feedback, and we continue to seek business feedback about how specific chapters can be improved. So the first part of the work that we're carrying out is around the general review. The second big piece of work that is underway is around accessions. So the significance of the CPTPP process is that it is an expanding agreement. It isn't static, both in terms of its rules, they're being reviewed, nor in terms of its membership. So very deliberately, the CPTPP open accession clause is genuinely global. It's open to any WTO member who wishes to apply. The original TPP had a much more regional focus. But when CPTPP was brought into force, there was a very deliberate decision made to make that language broader and more open. And that is one of the key reasons why the UK was able to join it without having that regional requirement or filter being applied. The other important thing that we did in our year was agree how we were going to conduct the process of considering candidates for accession. Very challenging, both in a technical sense, but of course, geopolitics intrudes. What we agreed, or what I should say, ministers agreed, is what we're calling the 3 Auckland principles that guide the accessions. And that's contained in a series of ministerial statements that came out in the New Zealand host year. The first principle, of course, is consensus. We all agree to start a process of accession with a particular candidate. The second is that candidate, we all agree, can meet the high standards of the agreement. And that, as the United Kingdom found, is a lengthy process, can take more than 2 years. And the third area is that accession candidate, we all agree, has a proven track record of compliance with their existing trade obligations, a very important principle. So those are the 2 big pieces of work that we are now conducting through CPTPP. And what it does, it places New Zealand at the very heart of the rulemaking process, the new rules that we are developing. Because please bear in mind that CPTPP is a WTO plus agreement. And it supports the World Trade Organization because it has an open accession clause and because the rules that we've developed add to the WTO rulebook. They don't subtract from it. They don't undermine the system. These are genuinely what the great trade economist Bagwati called building blocks to the multilateral trading system, not stumbling blocks. So this is not a termite in the system, the title of his famous book. This is actually a very important and foundational building block. And so some of the rules that we're going to be looking at what we might do on subsidies. One of the groundbreaking things that CPTPP did, which confounded all of us as FTA negotiators, who had always worked on the principle you can't do subsidies in a small group of trade agreement partners, you needed to do that with 100 plus members of the World Trade Organization. And yet CPTPP delivered subsidy disciplines on subsidies to the fisheries sectors. So we broke new ground. The question we're asking ourselves in the CPTPP conversation, what other subsidies could we collectively agree to address as part of this agreement? Particularly when we've signally failed to make progress at the WTO, whether on industrial subsidies or indeed, like any good trade negotiator from New Zealand, agricultural subsidies. What might we be needing to update on competition policy? How do we need to think about digital rules? And we know in New Zealand that our digital rules that we had in CPTPP are no longer sufficient. The Treaty of the Waitangi Tribunal, of course, found that we were in breach, that the e-commerce chapter of CPTPP was a breach of our commitments through the treaty. And so we need to add new safeguards in there to protect Indigenous knowledge and a range of other elements that we need to address in the agreement. So again, this is all part of the modernization and the general review of the agreement. There's an active discussion going on about trade and environment and trade and labor. And I think it's really important to remember that CPTPP, again, is the first agreement that we did that had these binding provisions. In other words, if we were found to have breached our environment or labor obligations, fines and sanctions could be applied against us as a consequence of a case that could be brought by any of the CPTPP partners. We often focus on the negative, but we should also remember the positive about this in terms of not just the credibility of the agreement, but for you as business, because there is an important provision in the CPTPP Trade and Labor and Trade and Environment chapter, which also reminds colleagues and partners in the agreement that you should not use environment and labor standards to create a barrier to trade. That is a very important principle that sometimes gets lost in the discussion about all of these things we've done on the environment and labor standards, is actually we have an offensive interest here because we are very vulnerable to other countries saying, oh, here's a new environmental standard. That's the only way you can get in. And there are big economies out there that are already doing that. I'm thinking of a deforestation piece of legislation in particular at the present. I won't name that set of countries. Let me now wrap up by simply saying, as I said, the golden weather at the start, that is well and truly over for New Zealand trade policy. We had a fantastic run. The jungle is certainly growing back. The big powers are certainly exerting themselves. They are, let us be honest about it, stepping outside of the rules-based trading system. But we cannot simply stand aside. We do need to control our own destiny, to shape and inform the rules and the norms that are going to be developed out there. And at the heart of that is, of course, CPTPP, because that is where new rules will be made, and New Zealand will be at the table to protect and advance our national interests there. So again, CPTPP, I hope you're going to hear more about the important commercial opportunities that it delivers, but I hope you will also see how important it is to us strategically to build that strategic trade depth that is critical to us in this very challenging period that is ahead of us. And thirdly, that New Zealand genuinely is at the heart of this agreement, that we have ambition for the agreement, that we have ideas for the agreement, and that we welcome your thoughts. And that brings me to my last slide, please. The 10 most terrifying words in the English language, said Ronald Reagan, is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. But we are genuinely here to help. And I want to encourage you, please, to tell us when you have a problem, not just with CPTPP, but if you have a problem with any other trade barrier that you're experiencing, we are genuinely here to help. And I don't just mean the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I mean NZTE, I mean MPI, I mean MB. We're a coordinating body. We are very effective and coherent in responding to business. And we will want to know how we can tackle your problem through here. No offense to New Zealand businesses, but you guys often think you're out there on your own. You have to fix it by yourself. You don't instinctively think that there are people who can help you here. And you have free trade agreements now. We have a committee on goods. We have working groups on non-tariff barriers. We have formal legal mechanisms that we can now use to prosecute your interests or your concerns or your problems. But you do need to tell us about them. So up there's a very useful tool, the Tariff Finder. You can type in what your product is. It will tell you what the tariff rate is that applies in a CPTPP country, but also all of our other FTA partners, and indeed those with which we don't have free trade agreements. We have, please subscribe to our market reports. They are sort of 1 to 2 page documents. We work really hard to make them as readable and crisp as we can. We welcome feedback, including constructive negative feedback, because we do want to sharpen this offering to make it relevant to you. We also welcome, through the portal, your advice about what you would like to see. What should our embassies be reporting on? This is your taxpayer dollar, and that is how it gets spent. And we want to make sure that you're getting genuine value out of it. So please do use all of these mechanisms. There's a telephone number, there's a website. exports@mfet.net is the best portal to go through, because that is the coordinating point that all of us as government agencies use. We have regular coordination meetings weekly to identify where the barriers are and how we're going to respond to them and how we deal with them. And part of that is using the free trade agreement architecture, including CPTPP, to find solutions for you. So please do not think you're alone. We are here to help you. We are genuinely here to help you. And please do remember CPTPP, the commercial, the strategic, and of course, critically putting us at the heart of developing new rules that will benefit you as New Zealand businesses. Thank you again.
Thank you, Vangelis, for those, as always, insightful comments. To help us explore a little bit more some of the commercial opportunities and challenges under CPTPP and our broader trade architecture, I'd like to invite our panelists to join us on stage now. First up, we have Stephanie Honey, who is the Managing Director of Honey Consulting, a trade policy consultant and former trade negotiator. In addition to specialising in digital trade, Steph is also the policy advisor to the New Zealand members of the APEC Business Advisory Council, chairs the New Zealand Horticulture Export Authority and was formerly the International Trade Policy Manager at Beefhamland, New Zealand. Welcome, Steph. We also have Danielle Adset, who is the Market Access Manager for New Zealand Apples and Pears. Her role is to support industry, which includes growers, packers and exporters, in maintaining, improving and gaining new market access to markets to ensure future profitability and diversification. And finally, we have Bridget Winter, who is Fisher & Paykel Healthcare's Regional Operations Manager for International Operations, based here in Auckland. Bridget has worked across a number of areas in her 10 years at Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, including regulatory, market access, quality, supply chain, and commercial operations. Tēnā koutou, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you all. To start us off, I thought it would be useful. Oh, it's not on. Sorry. That might be useful to start us off. Is that better? Is that better? Yeah. Great. Cool. Thank you. To bring a kind of a practical commercial lens to the discussion today, I thought it might be quite useful if we start with our business panelists, really just to kind of hear about your own experience with CPTPP. You know, what tariff or non-tariff benefits has the agreement brought to you or to other exporters that you work alongside? I'll start with you, Bridget.
I'm here today in more of a feedback session. Fisher & Paykel Healthcare typically does not leverage the CPTPP from a tariff benefit angle, but we do see there to be a huge benefit strategically with all the partners. I think to Vangelis's point that if we can build the economic might within the other markets that are part of the CPTPP, we can look to strengthen any or leverage any reason to be able to typically when there isn't an issue, it's all fine. But when there is an issue, that's when we need to build on the partnership with these other markets to be able to understand how we can get the benefit we need or to have the spirit of the agreement upheld. And I think that's where we see there to be a huge benefit with the current partners that are in the CPTPP, but also those that are looking to exceed into the agreement in the future. So that's probably where we're sitting at the moment with that.
Danielle?
Thanks. So we represent apple and pear growers, packers and exporters. And for us, the CPTPP had some pretty clear benefits. So we had a 17% tariff into Japan. And that's currently stepping off and is fully removed by 2028, which we're really excited about. But further to that, we also have some phytosanitary challenges there, and this agreement allows us to have the architecture to have those SPS negotiations directly with the Japanese government.
Thanks. And I think just to build on what Danielle said, you know, I think there are a number of important benefits that the CPTPP has given in the various, you know, hats that I wear. I mean, the most obvious sort of, you know, big picture thing is around the tariff piece. And as Danielle said, you know, there have been some fantastic benefits delivered there. Red meat is an area where, as you mentioned in the introduction, I've done quite a lot of work. And for example, there previously, New Zealand red meat exporters were paying a tariff of 38.5%. Sometimes it would snap back as high as 50%. But through the CPTPP, that is, as Danielle said with her apples and pears tariffs, it's stepping down, still has some way to go, it's fair to say. But, you know, that sector is accounts for 45% of the tariffs that New Zealand farmers pay or New Zealand exporters of red meat pay. I mean, it's just compelling to be able to get rid of those sorts of tariffs. And you can, you know, look across the range of our primary sector exports. Kiwi fruit into Japan is another really important example. The tariff there was only 6.5%, but, you know, the sort of key thing is it's given us a level playing field in a really valuable market. You know, we're not having to compete starting at a disadvantage with our competitors from Chile or other parts of the world. So the first thing is tariffs. I think another really important thing which Vangelis alluded to in his comments is also this idea of the trade being predictable, rules-based, enforceable. And I mean, when I started in trade 100 years ago, we said that, but like, what did it really mean? But I think we're unfortunately seeing the reality of that now. The IMF has estimated that the cost of the sort of economic fragmentation we're seeing now could potentially cost the world 7% of global GDP if that fragmentation continues. I mean, what does that mean for us? It means fewer opportunities to earn money, worse quality of life, fewer jobs. I mean, it has a real world impact. And what the CPTPP delivers, apart from needing to have a new acronym as part of the general review, is that, it gives us confidence that we can export into those markets and we'll be able to, and our products are not going to be stopped at the border. So one real world example of that is the dairy sector. I've also worked for Fonterra in my time. And, there, the market access, with all due respect, is pretty disappointing, particularly into Canada. But, they made a commitment and they haven't kept to it. And we have been able to, under the agreement, take them to court, essentially, and defend our rights to have access into that market. And I mean, what price can you put on that? It's absolutely critical and will become even more so. So the second thing is predictable and enforceable rules. The third thing, sorry, I know I'm going on, Justine, but the third thing is about regulatory coherence. Now, I'm sure I speak for everyone in this room that regulation is something to get you out of bed in the morning. But actually, again, that has a real world impact. If you're talking about non-tariff barriers, the grit in the machinery of whether it's a goods export or a global value chain, all that regulatory coherence stuff really matters. It erodes your margins. It makes it more expensive, more difficult to make high value added products. And the CPTPP agreement tries to get at that by streamlining regulation and making it more evidence-based. And particularly in the services sector, whether you're a creative economy exporter or a digital exporter, absolutely essential. And as Vangelis said in his introduction, the really important thing from my perspective as somebody who loves digital trade is it set the first global ambitious benchmark for good digital trade by saying, the default is free and open flows of data, minimal sort of regulatory impediments to digital trade with policy space. That really matters too, and protecting important legitimate goals like privacy or whatever. But, the high-tech sector is estimated to be our sort of second largest export category, and CPTPP essentially creates the enabling environment for that. And I think, even just to bring it back to goods trade, because obviously our primary sector is critical, another thing that the CPTPP did is to say, well, let's use these digital tools to make goods trade work better. At any one time, there's been an estimate I read that there are 4 billion pieces of trade-related paper circulating in the world at any one time. And what CPTPP says is, well, let's digitalise that. It doesn't make sense to be having pieces of paper literally going from A to B. I think I saw a Fonterra comment that it's cost millions of dollars a year to courier pieces of paper around the world. That doesn't make sense. We can do it digitally. So again, that is a groundbreaking piece of rulemaking that CPTPP has given, which generates income, jobs, growth in our economy. So I'm a fan.
Thanks, Steph. And look, I think what is sort of evident across the comments from the panel today is the breadth of benefits. So, it's not just the agricultural goods exporters, you've got advanced manufacturing, tech companies who are all benefiting, whether that's through tariff elimination or removals, through more predictable and consistent regulatory processes. And as Steph well acknowledged, and thank you for doing so, Steph, so as to preserve my neutrality as chair, having that predictability and that enforceability around those rules is really important, as we're seeing with the case that the New Zealand government has taken against Canada and the way that they're administering some of those dairy quotas. So, I think thanks very much for those comments, which I think really kind of help explain the breadth of those commercial benefits.
And we also heard from Vangelis earlier that the first general review of CPTPP is currently underway, and there's an opportunity for, what were considered groundbreaking rules at the time to be updated to, reflect modern supply chains and changes in global developments. I'd be interested in hearing from our business panelists, what are the kinds of things where you would see the opportunity to improve CPTPP? Steph, maybe we'll come back across and we'll start with you.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Look, I think it's fair to say that an agreement that was substantively written more than a decade ago needs to be modernised. I mean, the world has changed a lot in those few years. And I'd identify three sort of major areas which I think would be critical. I mean, let me also add a fourth for you, Justine, market access. We do need to finish that unfinished business on the market access side very clearly. You can't claim to have a gold standard agreement, as all the CPTPP members have said they want, if there are some sectors which are, blatantly discriminated against. So, I mean, leaving that aside, though, I think there are three really critical areas which have, I guess, come to the fore in trade policy conversations, but also, in our communities as important issues. So they are digital, sustainability and inclusion. And I mean, I think it's fair to say if you've been in any trade policy conversation in the last 5 years, 10 years, those are really major themes that people are concerned about. So on the digital side, CPTPP was great. It was groundbreaking, but more than in any other sector, 10 years in the life of the digital economy is, it's like dog years. It's, last century in more ways than one. So I think there's a lot, though, that the negotiators can crib from. I wrote an article for a Singaporean think tank, the Heinrich Foundation, about this. And one of my friends in the UK said, it's pretty ambitious, isn't it? And I thought at the time, oh gosh, I've sort of overreached. But actually, when you think about it, what we could do is really only reflect the best of the creative thinking that has happened among many of the CPTPP participants over the last 5 years, say. So there are a lot of digital agreements. Of course, the foremost among them is a New Zealand and Singapore and Chilean, brainchild. Looking at you, Vangelis, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. There's no reason at all why we can't incorporate the very innovative, sort of clever, integrated digital economy model that represents into the CPTPP. So that's the first thing, and building out things like that paperless trade angle. The second thing is sustainability. Next week, Death Valley is forecast to be the hottest that any temperature that's ever been recorded on Earth. It's going to be 56 degrees there next week. It doesn't need to be said, but this is a climate crisis. We actually need to use the commercial and market forces of business to drive to better climate outcomes. And, I think rewriting the CPTPP sustainability chapter, which again was groundbreaking for its time, is something that we can actively use to generate better outcomes for the planet, but also for business and for prosperity. There's a commercial value in taking action on this. So I think that should be done. And then lastly, inclusion, something that when I started in trade was not, a huge part of the conversation, but it's central now. Because why? It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing. There's value in helping small businesses to trade better. There's value in supporting women entrepreneurs or Indigenous, Māori businesses to trade. They create value and share that value with the community. And again, there are good regional models we can look at, a lot of them authored by New Zealand. It just makes sense to build those in. And I think there's a sort of compelling case across many of the CPTPP economies to do that. So I'd hope we would see all of that. Vangelis, please take them.
Thanks, Steve. Danielle.
Brilliant. So for us, it is one of the same things. So electronic exchange of certificates. So Japan and Vietnam are still largely paper-based, which is a real pain. And I think the second thing is for us, and it's probably a little bit of a tangent from this question, but what we're looking at for the apple and pear industry in particular, because we are kind of small but big, is how we can start to build more robust relationships, especially with the Northern Hemisphere partners. So a lot of these countries we're dealing with, they have strong domestic supply, especially of apples. I think Japan, I think of South Korea. And for us, it's how can we build a relationship with them so that we can supply them Southern Hemisphere apples, counter-seasonal, provide IP, provide capability building, and allow that counter-seasonal supply, which only just lifts apple consumption year-round. So it's a kind of a win-win, but we need to work hard now to keep building those relationships so we can cement them while we can.
Thanks, Danielle. Richard. Thanks. I think from our perspective, two key themes here. One is around nationalisation, and I think there are 5 key objectives the government had with the CPTPP. And I'll focus on just 2 of those. One was around the better standard of living for New Zealanders that it would bring, and again, the ability for the government to regulate in the best interests of New Zealand. And the flip side of that is that was also available to the economies party to the agreement. And where we find this to be detrimental to us is when we're told that you have to make in that country to be able to sell in the country. And although the parties here that I'm going to say are not actually part of the CPTPP, but we've found that there is made in China, made in India, made in Indonesia, which take up a large portion of the population in the world. And where we've had to fold during the COVID has been that we've always operated a hub and spoke model. So we've always centralised our inventory in either New Zealand or in Mexico, and we distribute from there. And we've just set up a manufacturing site in China. They had a policy back when I started 10 years ago, made in China 2025, and they haven't deviated from that deadline. What they have done is reduce what made in China looks like. And so we've had to set up a manufacturing site there, and that just increases costs to the hospitals, increases costs to the consumer, and we're duplicating our efforts where we have to now make in both those countries, which is hard to see. And I think this is where Vangelis's point before is it is an economic might that, it's hard for us to compete with, but this must also be impacting other economies as well within the CPTPP. Again, I appreciate China's outside of it, but they are looking or wanting to exceed into the CPTPP. So that is something that would be really helpful to consider. I think we also found during the pandemic as well was when you've got economies that are looking to freely trade. We were expressly asked by the US government and Mexico government in particular about our stock holdings that we had in those markets during the pandemic to effectively look at what was going to be in the best interest of their own economy before we were looking to be able to use that product that may be able to be sent out for global demand, given we were trying to also increase production at the time as well. There were just competing priorities there. We weren't blocked from being able to export from those markets if we needed to, but it was something that was raised. And again, in another pandemic, it may be a different situation. So I think there were some good examples there of how we had to manage those. I think the other one is around this harmonisation. And we work in a really heavily regulated environment where our market access is contingent on not just the product getting regulatory approval, but also the importer has to meet a certain level of requirements. So we have our license connected to many different aspects, whether or not it's our tax address, establishment address, where the local regulatory authority can come and audit us for different aspects to make sure we're adhering to requirements. So for us, having one license per market actually makes a lot of sense. Being able to leverage that license in a market from, let's say, if I've got regulatory approval in Mexico, to be able to then go to the Colombian Ministry of Health and say, look, this has already gone through a very stringent approval process. Can we have a fast track? That would be something that we would see to be very beneficial, but not actually having this harmonised approach, which is I've got one regulatory approval for the entire Latin American continent, and I get access. I think another part would be as well in the event of a field action or recall in our situation, and I appreciate that's also in the agricultural sense. It becomes very, very difficult to understand who is the authorised representative in that situation, who would actually be responsible for informing the markets of what the actions are for that recall. So I think there are just some key takeaways we've found with regards to what would be helpful for future consideration.
Thanks, Bridget. Vangelis, I'd like to give you perhaps an opportunity to maybe respond to some of the kind of the thoughts around the potential opportunities for improvement to CPTPP, and maybe also if you can talk a little bit about what opportunities there also are for businesses in the room to provide feedback to MFAT or to other CPTPP parties.
So maybe just say that these are really great and very helpful suggestions, and they are the kind of thing that we are looking to pursue. So to pick up your point, Steph, certainly from the New Zealand perspective, we do see the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement as the foundation stone for the review of that chapter. And there are clearly other elements. So we had a very big focus in our host year to convert as much as possible of the agriculture exports that we had into CPTPP partners by using sort of paperless documentation. I've got to say that is proving to be very, very hard work with some of our partners, who shall remain unnamed. But it is certainly a big feature of ours is to move into that digital space for all the good reasons that both you, Danielle, and indeed you, Birgit, also said. So, and certainly it's clear from when we were chairing last year, there was a strong emphasis on the need for the agreement to respond to kind of societal concerns about environment, in particular, climate change. So there is no reference in the agreement to climate change. And I think it's fair to say, certainly when we were chairing, there was a very strong sense from the membership that that wasn't a sustainable position anymore. We did need to find a response to that. Then on the inclusion points, certainly very strong focus on both the trade and gender piece and the reference point there is clearly for us the global trade and gender arrangement, which we put together with Chile and Canada at first, which is now expanded, including to several CPTPP members. So all of those elements certainly feature, but I think there are other elements that we can also look at, and I talked about some of them there. I think some of the things, I do think that we need to be looking at what are the great powers worried about? Industrial subsidies, the activities of particular partners that might be outside of the rules. In other words, they're not necessarily breaking the rules because the rules simply don't exist. So what kind of rules would we like to see there? And I think that's a really important discussion for us to be having in there. And as I said, industrial subsidies, agricultural subsidies, we've got the fisheries subsidies agreement at the WTO, which is only partially concluded. But that is something that we could bring into the CPTPP, which already has a foundation element on subsidies. And again, these do deliver real benefits to New Zealand exporters. So the New Zealand fishing industry is not subsidised. Other industries, including from some CPTPP partners, are subsidised. They're having to reduce that. That improves prices. That improves the returns for the New Zealand exporters. So a nice combination with the work on tariffs and so on. So I think all of those things are going to be really important features. It's very much a case of watch this space, but don't watch this space passively. We do want to hear from you. So what we have done is, so last year as part of the seeking feedback for the terms of reference for the general review, we got a lot of feedback from New Zealand business. That closed at the end of October, the 1st of October, as we ran into the final parts of the senior officials meetings to wrap up the year. Then we reopened the window again in April this year to get specific feedback on chapters that are under review. So all of the CPTPP chapters, and by the way, that does indeed include, at least for some CPTPP partners, market access. And I would just make two observations on market access. One is, indeed, from a New Zealand perspective, there is a lot of unfinished business in the agreement. That, let me acknowledge that, and indeed to take responsibility as well. So there is a lot of unfinished business, particularly in the agriculture area. I think we also need to remember that as new aspirants apply to join, what does that mean for some of the access conditions that some of us negotiated in good faith as part of the original CPTPP? So are those new members going to have access to some of the special arrangements that were made for New Zealand, for Australia, and for other partners in the agreement? We have a clear view on that. But it's important, I think, that we resolve that. So we've got some quite challenging questions to resolve, and I don't want you to think that all CPTPP members are of one mind on all of these things. It is going to be a negotiation. So it's really important to remember this is a review, but there is going to be a negotiation, because as we look to update it, people are going to have different views. That is going to be a very powerful mechanism, I think, including to attract interest from some other partners that are out there that might have an interest in joining the agreement, because they'll see the dynamism of CPTPP. The issues that we're grappling with are the modern issues that we simply are not able to make progress at the World Trade Organization, sadly. And my final thing, just on your question, yes, we do welcome comments. I hope we might be able to put that slide up again just to remind people that the best, so there's two emails that are really good. cptpp@mfact.govt.nz, and then the one I put up earlier, the exporter at mfact.net. We can make sure that gets circulated to all the people that signed up today as well. So we welcome continual feedback, but not just feedback on the review. Please do tell us if you have a problem. Don't suffer and fester out there on your own thinking, geez, these MFAT people, they talk this great game about this wonderful FTA and I've just got these endless problems. We've actually got people that work on these problems for you. And we are very committed to doing that. And what we do is we build a strategy around it. And you're not alone. You'll often find that there'll be a New Zealand exporter that has a problem getting fish into market X. We'll quickly establish that Chile has the same problem, so does Peru. Let's all work together and approach that particular CPTPP partner or any other FTA partner to find a resolution to it. Can we raise it through the World Trade Organization, the range of committees that are there? And then, you know, as the Canadians have discovered, we are prepared to enforce our rights as well as a small state. And we know that Canada, as a G7 partner, is a very responsible actor, and that as the process goes through its normal judicial procedures, that both sides will obviously observe the rules of this very important agreement.
Thank you.
A long answer, sorry.
Thank you, Vangelis, and great to hear of the sort of extensive opportunities that have been afforded to the business community to provide feedback, and that opportunity continues. And I do want to give the audience an opportunity to provide feedback or ask questions in this session today. But before we turn to audience Q&A, I do want to touch on another sort of issue that you outlined in your presentation, Vangelis, which is the question of accessions. Obviously, there is it was fantastic to see the UK's accession completed last year, and that will enter into force, I understand, in the second half of this year. And obviously, there is a long line of other potential aspirants that have indicated an interest in joining the agreement as well. Firstly, I'd like to turn to our sort of business representatives to just ask your views on the accession process. Are there specific economies that you would like to see, form part of CPTPP at some point in the future? Bridget, let me start with you.
So as mentioned at the beginning, medical devices typically attract 0% tariffs. So from a tariff perspective, there is limited benefit with regard to this. So it comes down to the non-tariff benefits, which of course there are multiple aspects to that which you would be focusing on. So I think what is a really helpful way to look at it as well is, I think the graph that Vangelis had initially was when you've got China and Hong Kong at 23% of our trade and the ability for them to come into it. But there's all the geopolitical aspects as well to take into account, that if Taiwan's looking to exceed at the same time, how does that address? And it's not for me to even try and get my head around that one. But I think that it becomes down to that at the end of the day, free trade is good for New Zealand, it's good for our economy, and the more markets that we can have that we can be seen to be trading with is a good thing, especially when we are so small, but we can band together That's sort of where we think. I think one other thing that was quite an interesting thing we had last year, just on the climate change and how it can directly impact trade, is there was the droughts in the US, which actually impacted the ability for the Panama Canal to actually have a number of ships going through. We were setting up a direct operation in Colombia. It would go live 1 November. 2-month lead time with shipping. So September, had supply chain, product was on water, we're all good to go, and the container gets held up in the canal. So it managed to get there in time, but it was completely outside of our control. No matter of planning preparation could have got us through that one. So there are, again, that's just a really practical example of how the climate change can directly impact our ability to trade. So I think it's, again, these non-tariff benefits are hugely beneficial to us to be considering outside of the tariff, actual direct tariff financial impact.
Yeah, so for us, I suppose the challenge, and it's INFAT's challenge, is how we allow new countries in, but maintain a high quality for the agreement. We have plenty of countries where we've got lots of NTBs, and I won't list them all off, but I'm happy for some of those to join. But more specifically, South Korea is a market where we've got a 50% tariff and we don't have phytosanitary access. So for us, that's a real clear market that we would be looking to, I suppose, join CPTPP at some stage and have some benefits that can flow on from that.
Thanks. Like the others, more is better, bigger is better. I mean, the modern model of trade or doing business is about a global mindset. It's about global value chains. So we should be aspiring to have as many countries in the tent as we can. But that's not, a blank check. They need to be able to show, in the words of the Auckland Principles, a demonstrated pattern of compliance. And I mean, we've seen some pretty horrifying examples of economic coercion in action in the region. We don't want those sorts of behaviours legitimised by a trade agreement. So I think that's a really important threshold. But also a sort of commitment to following the rules and wholeheartedly implementing them is critical too. So I think, there's a really important group of aspirants, including from Europe, or the sort of the edge of Europe. Ukraine is also on that list. And I think, to your point earlier, Vangeli, it's showing that this can be a truly sort of global building block to a more sort of coherent market. But some of my work is with the APEC Business Advisory Council, so of course it's my duty as a good ABAC person to also mention that, I do think even though it's a global agreement, there's a really compelling case to build out the Asia-Pacific membership of this agreement. And there's sort of a push and a pull for that. I mean, one of the ideas that APEC has had for 20 plus years is the idea that we would have a regional free trade area which could bring in CPTPP, it could bring in RCEP, that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, it could bring in the Pacific Alliance, so those Latin American Pacific Rim economies. But, there's a sort of compelling synergy to having all those economies in. But for them too, there's a compelling case because there's been some very interesting modelling that's been done about, well, what's the cost of staying out? And, there is very clearly going to be a sort of a hum of energy and trade and integration among those parties that are in. So, there's a real case to be part of that. The parties going on in CPTPP and come aboard to get those benefits. So I think, if they can meet the Auckland Principles, we should be welcoming all aspirants with open arms. Thanks.
Thanks, Steph. And maybe Vangelis, interested in your perspectives. You earlier outlined the framework and for CPTPP members to consider new aspirants in terms of the Auckland Principles, and some feedback and thoughts around, who from a kind of a market access perspective would be, or a strategic perspective would be valuable for New Zealand. Your thoughts on how New Zealand and INFAT is kind of approaching the question of these multiple accession aspirants?
So, I mean, it's a daunting group that is there now. So you've got, you've got China, you've got Taiwan, you've got Ecuador, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Ukraine, and we are expecting more applications to come. And publicly, we know, it's public information, Korea has had an interest, Indonesia has recently expressed interest, so has the Philippines. So those are all, I think, very exciting developments. I make the observation we actually have free trade agreements with all of them, but they are indeed incomplete. You know, Danielle, you mentioned with North Korea. North Korea. South Korea. You get that really right.
You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
So definitely South Korea, where we have a lot of unfinished business, and that I know a lot of us would really value that. I'll make another observation there about attracting partners into that group. It is really the case, first of all, that the Auckland principles, I mean, these were really carefully worked through and drafted. The language was really thought through. Those three principles are critical for the way in which each of us is now approaching the question of who we now proceed with. So we are going to very carefully assess each of the aspirants against that. And that will be a continual process. So it won't be a static moment in time. It'll be a continuous ongoing discussion with all of those that have expressed an interest in joining. The other point I'd like to make is that it is really important for the dynamics and the dynamism of the agreement that we continue to attract that attention. So, you know, those three major regional players that I mentioned will be really important. That has a real head-turning effect. Never forget that one of the things that we don't have, you know, all of these aspirants, with many of them we already have an FTA. We don't have an FTA with the United States. So, of course, one of the things we hope is that as this agreement expands, that has a bit of a head-turning effect in Washington, that it will give a little bit of a jolt in Brussels, that in Delhi too, and indeed in Beijing, they continue to see this agreement as a real locus for where the new and interesting work is going to get done around rules. And just a small word on APEC. APEC is absolutely critical in terms of the norm building. So never underestimate the value that APEC has given us in terms of the norms that we've then converted into the rules that we've used in CPTPP. So if you look at, there's a direct line between the customs procedures, in other words, the very practical things that get your product across the border faster and more reliably, straight back to the work that was done in APEC in the 80s and the 90s. That built confidence, it built trust. That is what allowed us to move forward with the ASEAN Australia New Zealand FTA, the CPTPP, and of course RCEP and so on. If I may, one last observation. Just, I mean, I take your point on the zero tariffs, that you already enjoy a zero tariff. Please don't forget that this is sort of a general observation. What CPTPP does is it binds that in. So yes, you may currently enjoy an applied rate of 0, and that's great. But in this world, people are changing their minds about tariffs and they're lifting the tariff. What the free trade agreement does, it makes it would be a breach of the agreement for Mexico, for example, now to say, actually, I'm going to increase the tariff to 20%, which is what my binding is in the WTO rules. They can't do that through the free trade agreement. So what you've got through the free trade agreement is that certainty that that 0% tariff applies for you, for New Zealand, always. It does not apply for the EU. So the EU doesn't, oh, sorry, that's a bad example, because the EU does have an agreement with Mexico. Let me think of a partner that doesn't have an agreement with Mexico. Can you think of one? Anyway, someone out there doesn't have an agreement with Mexico. They may be trading in a medical device that goes in at 0, actually China. And the Mexicans might decide, look, why am I using poor old Mexico? Anyway, that other country with a 0 tariff can at any time increase it. So please don't underestimate what these agreements actually do. They bind in the commitment, they make it enforceable, and there are mechanisms through the FTA that give you that certainty, they give you the transparency, and they give you that guarantee of that access so you can actually plan your business in a way in this volatile world where we're seeing lots of players changing their minds about relatively low tariffs and then jacking them up. 100% tariffs imposed by President Biden. This is a different world we're in. What CPTPP does, it smooths out that risk and gives you that guarantee. So even though you're going in at 0, you will continue to go at 0, but that is because of CPTPP. Thanks.
Thanks, Vangelis. And yeah, that's a very useful reminder about the lots of diplomatic relationships that have exposed in that series of examples. Look, I do want to open up the panel, who I think have provided some really useful insights for audience questions. Juliana, I don't know if we've got a roving microphone, but would be please put up your hand and Liz will bring a microphone to you. Charles.
Hi.
You might need to. Here we go.
Okay. Hi, my name is Charles Finney. Just to continue the accession theme, and just comment to Bridget. I actually think Mexico is a very good example because we have no certainty that one major player is actually going to respect free trade agreements post November, and you could well find there's a 10% tariff imposed across the border. Hopefully it won't happen, but it might happen to a number of other jurisdictions, and it's going to have real implications for the medical devices industry. So I agree with you, Vangelis. I think there's going to be a flood of interest in CPTPP post November. My question is, the Auckland principles are fine, but they don't say anything about accelerating the process of accession. And one of the real issues is it's taking so long for new members to accede. Even the UK, which was relatively straightforward, took what in my view was too long. So what can we do to speed up the process of accession when South Korea or Thailand or Indonesia actually says we want to do it now?
Vangelis, I think that one's for you.
Thanks. Look, it's a very fair question around the accessions, and one we really grappled with. We got very strong feedback from the UK that there was a certain frustration about the pace at which we were moving. And actually, I think that is a fair enough query. The challenge we have is that the complexity of the agreement, and then all of us needing to be confident that the information that's given to us really does meet the disciplines and the rules. And that did take us a long time. And we are working within the group, including because of some work that Japan did as the chair of the working group that considered the UK accession, plus the UK feedback, plus work that we did as well in our host year about how we might streamline those procedures. So some real thought being given to how much we could do digitally, how much we can do intersessionally, trying to get away from having to have these colossal meetings of literally hundreds of people getting together to work on what the rules are. I think it's really important to underline too that this isn't actually a negotiation on rules. It is a process whereby the aspirant needs to lift their stance and demonstrate how they've lifted their ability to meet those rules. Where there is a negotiation, it will be around the market access, but again, there are some fundamental flaws, FLOOR, through which our partners will not deviate. So there is a clear understanding about how much you need to do and what high expectations CPTP members as a whole have. So using digital and intersessional exchanges, more of the written procedure kind of thing to try to find that. And then also very activist chairs. We're trying to introduce the idea of having more chairs of particular working groups and giving them more authority than I think we were very reluctant, and I speak here as New Zealand as well, to give too much power to the chairs of each of the working groups. And so again, I think that's one of the procedural things that we could do to accelerate the process. Look, it is a challenge. There are some small economies like New Zealand in there. I've got to say, I've got a limited amount of people with the specialised knowledge and ability to do this. We have CPTPP, we have a range of other negotiations underway. You've got people that are just having to manage it. So we have a genuine resource challenge as well. I don't think any of us had predicted how quickly there would be this strong level of interest from a whole range of partners. So we are needing to think about, do we need to do multiple accessions at the same time? How would we do that? If you look at what we're trying to do with the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, I think that gives you a flavour of some of the things that we're trying to do to be practical. So, for example, we are meeting with all of the aspirants at the same time, at the same location. We expect them to come. Recently, there was one in Auckland, China, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and others. God, no, not Ecuador. Canada, thank you. Canada. making a series of appalling errors here, leaving bilateral relations in smoking ruins. My colleagues in foreign affairs will not be impressed. But, so we're trying to, there's some practical procedural things we can do. I think we're all, as CPTPP colleagues, we're all very focused on needing to streamline the process, including simply to ease the burden on our own technical experts.
Thanks, Vangelis. Matthew, I think this might be the final question, unless anyone's got, okay, two more.
Well, as most of the panelists know, I'm the director of the Latin American Cape, so unsurprisingly, my question has a Latin American angle to it. I fully support and applaud the idea to make CPTPP more of a global agreement than a regional one. So how, though, are you going to keep the spirit of regional innovation alive? Because some of the most innovative partners here have been New Zealand, Chile, Singapore, the P4, G-Target. As we bring in other players, how do you keep that sort of pioneering core going, or does this simply have to be sacrificed in the interest of bigger players, bigger opportunities?
I don't mean to pick on you, Vangelis, but I think that one's for you as well.
I'm actually quite confident that in the CPTPP process, we are able to keep that sense of innovation and that sort of willingness to try new and interesting things in the way that we did in the original agreement. Take fish subsidies, for example. So I think there's two elements to that. There's working within the group, and I think the really good thing is that New Zealand is, of course, there. The second is the reference points that we have out there. So Digital Economy Partnership Agreement is clearly one. The Indigenous Partnership for Economic Cooperation and Trade Arrangement is another that we'd like to see in the agreement. Again, Canada's in that, Australia's in that, New Zealand, of course, is there as well. And then, of course, on climate change, again, the innovation piece. And it's not just regional players that are innovative. I think of the agreement that was just concluded on Monday, the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. Costa Rica, Switzerland, Iceland, New Zealand. Again, the classic kind of P4 Digital Economy Partnership Agreement model for innovative policy entrepreneurial small states trying something new. Now, just to come on to the climate change point, to make the observation that there's the classical trade response to climate change, which is take away the tariffs on environmental goods, solar panels, wind turbines, and so on. And then on services, try to remove the restrictions or schedule real commitments in that space. So environmental goods and services is a really orthodox approach. What the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability did, that we certainly are looking to bring into the CPTPP, at least for the discussion, is that it also uses a trade agreement to reform and eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. So the four of us innovative, but looking to bring it back into the agreement, because we know that the four of us, New Zealand, Iceland, Costa Rica, and Switzerland, in ourselves are not going to make a major difference in climate change. But what we are able to say is to our G7 and G20 partners, you guys have been saying you want to reform fossil fuel subsidies. You've acknowledged that it has a major impact on climate change. You've been saying that since 2009. Actually, back in 2009, fossil fuel subsidies were about $480 billion. It's now over $1 trillion. And you've been saying every year you want to, and APEC has been the same. We've been saying it every year, we want to do this reform. What we've said in the agreement that was put out on Monday, and that we are looking to bring actively into the CPTPP, is to say, well, the rhetoric's great. Here's actually a trade agreement, as we did with agriculture in the WTO agreement on agriculture, as we did in CPTPP on fish subsidies. Here's the rules that we could use in CPTPP to reform fossil fuel subsidies as well. So again, the innovation piece is looking at the reference points, not just working only within ourselves, but using some of the interesting things that are happening outside and bringing them into this other critical agreement. So I do think I'm very confident that the innovative spirit continues. And actually, even the big players too in CPTPP are genuinely interested in finding the new cutting-edge elements that keeps the CPTPP at the forefront of modern rulemaking that benefits business internationally.
Thanks, Vangelis. And I think we've got one final question at the back of the room.
Hello, this is Tahi from Korea New Zealand Business Council. Thanks for organising this event. And I understand Korea has expressed their expression to join the CPTPP. So I'm hoping to actually Korea, in my personal opinion, so Korea to join this agreement so that we can actually host this event next year together. But second of all, I'm currently working at Systema Plastics New Zealand, so one of the plastic manufacturer based in New Zealand, and we are exporting to 110 countries at this moment. And just wanted to understand a little more or recommendation or what kind of benefits could we get as a New Zealand manufacturer and consumer goods throughout the CPTPP? Yes. If anyone can answer.
Thank you. Actually, that's a really easy question to answer because for plastics, it's a zero tariff already for across all of the CPTPP partners. So there is an immediate benefit. The average tariff on tariffs was, I remember from when we first were doing it, the average tariff on plastics was 7%, with some peaks of 14% in a couple of the CPTPP partners. But for all of them now, it's zero. So you should not have a problem. You shouldn't have a tariff problem. If you have some other problem with any of the CPTPP partners, please don't hesitate to contact us at the exporter@mfat.net line. We really do want to hear from you and make the agreement work for you. But you should certainly not have a tariff problem. And there are other free trade agreements. In fact, I'm trying to think in all of our free trade agreements currently, EU, UK, yes, they're all zero. So all of the free trade agreements we've got for plastics, for the products that that Systema provides, because Systema provided us some really good information when we were concluding the UK and the EU one. We checked with the previous agreements, and you are fully covered in all of. You're one of the lucky ones. You're not an agriculture exporter, so you should have no problem. You may have other problems, and we're here to help you.
Wow, how's that for service? Look, thanks very much for those great questions and to our panelists, or at least Vangelis, for answering most of those. I don't want to take too long in terms of summing up, but I think from my perspective, there have been a couple of really key and useful points for us to sort of remember and to take away from this discussion. I think the first is really around the importance of FTAs and CPTPP in particular in terms of providing those commercial and strategic benefits. We've heard directly, even just now, in terms of plastic exports, the direct tariff benefits that contribute to the bottom line for business. But we've also heard about those kind of broader strategic benefits in terms of the certainty and enforceability, particularly in a more challenging geopolitical and trade outlook. Then we've also heard that there remains unfinished business, both in terms of market access in particular, and as an agricultural exporter, we certainly feel that, but also opportunities through the review processes and future upgrades of the agreement to look at issues around digital, paperless trade, sustainability and inclusion. And a bit of a shout out for Steph's Heinrich Foundation article, which is a really good read on these topics in particular. And it's really important that trade rules continue to be updated to reflect, changes in society and the global trading environment. The other sort of key point, I think, for me is just the importance of the strategic relationship. So even where there aren't those kind of immediate commercial or financial benefits, the long-term connections and relationships that are sort of solidified through these agreements is also really important for a small, distant country at the bottom of the world. And then finally, I think we've had a really interesting discussion on accessions. There's clearly a lot of interest, I think, amongst the business community in terms of how that process plays out, a lot of opportunity to improve our trading relationships with key partners, and also, I guess, some challenges that we'll need to manage in terms of some of those existing sort of access arrangements for certain products into existing CPTPP markets. And then finally, I think, you've also heard today, there's just a really great range of tools and ways to connect in with the New Zealand government, with MFAT, but also NZTE, MPI, MB, as well as a raft of experience and expertise amongst the business community in terms of how to leverage the opportunities from these agreements. So I'll leave it there, but please do join me in thanking our fantastic group of panellists for what has been a really useful and interesting discussion today. I think I'm handing back to you, is that right?
Yeah, correct. But you've done a great job, Justine, of saying what I was saying, so it won't be too long. My name's Liz Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the RCU New Zealand Business Council. As I said, I won't keep you here too long, but I'd like to say on behalf of the organising business councils, our huge and very sincere thanks to all of the speakers. Justine, you've put in so much time and effort to the structure of this event, so we really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Bridget. It's amazing to have someone from Fisher & Paykel Healthcare here giving a really free and frank discussion on what can be improved. Danielle, the horticulture sector is so important to New Zealand, so we really appreciate your time and coming. Steph, amazing, what can we say? You are great across so many areas. We love your support. Vangelis, superstar. Thank you so much for coming from Wellington. It is totally fantastic. And my phone's now died. Of course, the Capes. Thank you very much, Paul, for your very generous support hosting this really important discussion. And I'd like to just also quickly echo some of the points. This event was designed to inform you, but also to seek your input into the CPTPP review process. So please don't hesitate to be in touch. It's said that you can't measure what you don't know. So please do reach out to the NZ team, let them know your issues, areas that you'd like to see improved as part of this review process. I'm a big advocate for the genuine support and help that New Zealand agencies want to give to New Zealand business. MFAT, Customs, MPI, NZTE, etc., are all very much here to help. Business councils, we are here to help too. We provide knowledge and market contacts. New Zealand just generally has a great collaborative approach. So please do get involved. That's it from me. So on behalf of the organising councils, thank you all for being here today. Thank you to those who've joined online. We appreciate you being here too. For those in person, please stay, have something to eat, network. That's what we're here for too. Thank you again.